In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. I believe that to be true. I believe that's what the book teaches. And I believe that makes the most sense of any explanation of how we got here. We live in a world that is, it seems to be dominated by unbelief. I don't know what exact percentage of our society, certainly in America, are atheists, probably less here than in many places in the country. But it seems sometimes to be overwhelming. The message of the world is that those who believe in God are people who don't use their minds, and that smart people all believe it all to be superstitious. We've tried in the lessons that we've presented to show that it's reasonable and right to believe that creation has a creator. And we have looked to this point at several reasons. One, the very existence of things suggests the idea that unless you believe matter is eternal, it had a beginning, and thus it had a creator. We looked also not just at the existence of matter, but the design of the world and its intricacy and its systematic approach and working, which suggests the idea that this is a machine that's not random. And we began this morning some thoughts about life and its amazing quality, and how that the explanation of the world simply will not do. This is a little too small to see, I'm sure, but you'll find charts like this along and along where someone will say, now here is really how the world came to be. The world began about 5 billion years ago. Question, where did it come from? Don't ask. And that about 3.5 million years ago, we have the first life. Question, where did the life come from? Questions that are not generally welcome, but this is consistent. You start with the world being here from nowhere, and then you find life. And how does life come from matter? Well, it starts off simply, and then over millions of years, it goes into the idea of what we see today around us, including humanity. This is a book on simple life forms. We tried to say this morning that simple is maybe a relative term, but actually life is not simple. And we looked at the example, even Dawkins, who's the famous atheist, also a fellow who knows something about zoology and biology, and he admits the fact that the so-called simple life forms, like an amoeba, in the nucleus of an amoeba, you have the DNA messages that are more than 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica in terms of the quality, the content, I should say, of the information in a simple life form. And if you look at the entire amoeba, it would be, DNA would be something like 1,000 complete sets. We talked this morning just a little bit about how DNA is the building block of life, and how that it really determines the form and the function of a being. It contains an amazing amount of information in the simplest life form. And we also looked this morning at how Carl Sagan wrote a book on the human brain, in which he talked about how that the human brain, if the information it contains could be expressed in bits, would equal about 100 trillion bits. It would fill some 20 million volumes. It's a big place in a small space. And Sagan says, the circuitry of a machine more wonderful than any devised by humans. He believes it came about by random process, blind chance. It's a remarkable thing how people can be so willfully blind about this great witness of the Creator. That's the point, isn't it? Life contains a message expressed in DNA. And those chemicals cannot cause the message any more than the pen and ink can create the message. They're an instrument. The message points to a messenger greater than that which is made, an intelligence beyond creation, To follow the evidence of life leads us back to the first cause, the intelligent cause, the Creator. One fellow put it this way, that DNA is coded information. A code requires a code writer. Who would deny such? And therefore, design demands a designer. It is design. It's not random. We know those two words. We understand the difference between something that's random and something that is, in fact, designed. I don't know if they still sell alphabet cereal or not, but this is on a level even I can understand. Alphabet cereal, it's amazing. Cereal makers will just shape the same old stuff, sugar and starch, into little shapes, and they can put a picture on the box and sell a jillion boxes of it. And so Alphabets came up with the idea, that whoever the maker was, Post, whoever it was, we're going to shape the cereal in terms of the alphabet. Kids will get a kick out of that. So if you ever had any of that, you remember maybe pouring it into a bowl, maybe some of it was spilled, and occasionally you might look in the bowl and you might find a two-letter word or something that might come about. Or, if you drop it on the floor, maybe you would have a letter or two that would accidentally arrange themselves in a certain way, and that's an accident. That's random, really, and we're reading into something that's random. However, if as a kid you got to the breakfast table and Mom had spelled this out, you can be sure that that was not an accident or random, that there's a message that's intended for us. And that's a serious point. There's a difference between things that are random. You can't suggest that the human brain is just random chance without designer. I've never been out west. Some of you guys, I'm sure, have. But I'm told you go out to some of these desert places and you can see some amazing rock formations that have been shaped by the wind and the sand blowing. And they are interesting to look at. And we would say that, there was not a designer so much as it's simply the act of the wind. It's the randomness of it all. But when you go to Mount Rushmore, you don't get that thought. Mount Rushmore, it screams out, somebody made this. There's an artist behind that art. I'll tell you why that's relevant. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of a group called, the acronym is SETI. It's the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's a group of people, many scientists, enthusiasts, who believe that there's life out there in other planets in the far reaches of the solar system or even beyond, and that what they do is use their skills, use some large equipment to try to aim these radio receivers into the realms of space and to capture in deep space what they hope will be a message. Now, the question is, how do you know the difference? This is, again, probably put in poor terms because space, I know, is a vacuum. But there's a lot of noise in space, and radioactive materials that create things that can be picked up by these scopes. And so that kind of thing goes on regularly. And it's sort of what we would say is static. I've never done this kind of work. I did as a kid listen to an AM radio. And if you are old enough to remember what AM radio was, we used to like to listen to sports. And before the days of cable sports, on Saturday night, you might tune that radio and you'd be looking for KMOX out of St. Louis. Catch a Cardinal game. Or you might be listening for whatever the station was down in New Orleans. LSU, old, whatever the fellow's name, I can't remember his name now, Ferguson was a great old announcer there. You'd catch the game Saturday night. You'd be going through that dial, you'd hear a lot of static and a lot of noise, and it didn't mean anything, and then you'd hear, okay, that's a message. I know what that is. It might even fade in and out, but I knew what it was. There's a difference in static and a message, a purpose. So that's what, in a very simple way, what these guys are looking for. Now, when I was in high school, I remember reading about this. It was in one of those giant, we had some of those in West Virginia when I lived there years later. But there was a great, the Big Ear, they called it, I think. It was designed to catch these messages from space or listen to space, listening for something that might be a message. Anyway, in 1977, I think it was, after, just constantly, they've been listening for years. And you'd find these weak signals and randomness and nothing to, and then one day, they looked at the data the next day and they saw that they had received a number of strong signals that they had not received before. And by the way, they didn't receive afterward. But the guy who read the data the first time wrote on the side of the paper it was recorded on the word wow. And this became, known as the wow result, And so they've been, and it was a hot interest and a lot of press coverage at that time. And of course, they all focused on that part of the sky where they thought they had gotten this message from while they were trying to figure out what it might say. Never heard another word, never heard. I don't know what the explanation was. They still don't know what that was or why. But my point is that here are these people thinking there might be life in outer space, and they're listening with great intent for something that's not random. Because they know when there's something not random, they've got a message. We've mentioned already Carl Sagan. Again, for the young people, he was a celebrity of another generation. He was a Cornell astronomer, and he was popular culture darling for a while. He also authored a book called Contact. I think they made a movie out of it. It's fiction. But it's fiction about some of these people, these SETI people, who, according to the novel, one day, sure enough, they received not static, but a message in prime numbers. And everybody realizes that the aliens are trying to contact us, and the book goes on about whatever happened next. But how you knew that was because it was a message. It wasn't random. There was a pattern there. And somebody made the point. They said, the irony of this is that Sagan was absolutely convinced that a simple string of prime numbers would prove the existence of an intelligent message sender. But the equivalent of 1,000 or 20 million encyclopedias in living beings doesn't. That is something. These people are looking for patterns in the sky, but they don't look at the patterns they see all around them and see a creator. It takes a lot of faith not to believe in God, and I believe that's so. When you think about cells, Michael Denton is another name that you may or may not know, but he's a biochemist, a well-educated fellow, and not a believer, or not at least a Christian as you would think of it, by any means. But as an expert in chemistry and with a knowledge of the chemistry in the human body, he once wrote, the complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it's impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle. Exactly. One more along this line. Ariel Roth is a believer and also an expert in biology. And he once made this comment. I thought it was worth repeating. He said, God never performed a miracle to convince an atheist because his ordinary works provide sufficient evidence. Exactly. That's the point we're trying to make. When someone would grab your attention and tell you that it's just silly to believe in God, remember the witness that God has left in this world and in life, even our own life, and understand that we have the handiwork of God all around us and in us. At some point, I wanted to touch on this subject as well. Don't you believe in evolution? And I think that's a question that I need to answer carefully, because I want to know what they mean when they say evolution. Evolution is change. Okay, do you believe in change? I think everybody believes in change. Change within species. There's a term that the world doesn't like, but I think it's appropriate. We talk about microevolution. One obvious example would be, do you believe that there are different types of dogs? Of course you do. Everybody does. All these species that have developed, some have been bred for that purpose. Some have developed outside of the work of men. But these breeds of dogs represent, in a sense, a certain measure of change, evolution, if you want to call it that. I think that's what Darwin saw. His famous finches, he was there, observing in the Galapagos Islands the animals there, and he saw birds with different types of beaks. And he began to think, well, now, nature is just evolving, and all of these different types are developing, from natural selection and from their environment and so on. But when you think about that, I mean, really, all of these birds were coexisting. So it wasn't like you had a bird and then millions of years later you had, over time, it had developed into something else. It's just changed within species. I don't know that anybody would, in and of itself, argue against that. It's a reality. But these fellows are talking about millions of years. The problem is, you can't do an experiment that looks at millions of years. Just won't work. So, one of the things that folks have done, those particularly who have an interest in evolutionary theory and how that might apply, is they have used little creatures like the fruit fly. Because fruit flies multiply rapidly, and you can get many generations just over a few days. So they've been looking for years at the fruit fly, I suppose looking and waiting for some change. Well, there are a lot of changes. They've through the years had these fruit flies multiply, and I'll tell you what they've gotten. They've gotten fruit flies that have too many wings, and some have too few wings, and some of them can see, and some can't see, and some can fly, and some can't fly. But I'll tell you what they have fruit flies of various kinds, various descriptions, change within species. What they don't have is what some fellow said is a crocoduck, or some such thing. That's what you don't have. Macroevolution. And that's really the theory, isn't it? That you start with this one-cell organism, and from that, from the ooze that we talked about this morning, has come all of life. And all these different kinds of species. That's what you don't have the evidence for. So, when we're talking with our friends and neighbors and we love them, and they say, I know evolution is true because we see evolution happening all the time. You see the double talk there? You see the problem? Well, we believe in change, of course. But the kind of change you're talking about, there's not evidence for. And that's the problem. One smart fellow said, in grammar school they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fairy tale. In university they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fact. In a sense, I think that's not exaggerated. But, what about the similarities of these species? There are similarities. Doesn't that suggest the idea that they came from a common ancestor? I may have shared this with some of you before. I'm sure I have. Years ago, my family and I made a trip to Washington, D.C. This was a vacation time. And we had our itinerary planned, only there for a few days, and there's a lot to see in that city. This building did not make the cut. This is the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and I had no interest in going there. It's not that I don't like natural history, but I knew, when we went in there, and our kids at the time were older, but I knew what I was going to find was just heavy-handed preaching of this atheistic evolutionary theory. And they didn't disappoint, by the way. It just so happened that we had a few minutes, and we were literally right in front of the building. Hadn't planned to be. And we thought, well, we can go in for a few minutes. So we did. And they had an exhibit, I don't know, I guess it may be a regular exhibit, that was years ago, on our ape heritage. Our ape heritage. Fossils and DNA confirm that humans and primates, members of the great ape, are members of the great ape family. And although we did not evolve from any of the apes living today, we share characteristics with chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans and other apes. Does that cheer your day? And then we went to another wall where they had this. Now, again, forgive me, these pictures are terrible. And I've said before, there are two reasons for that. One, this was taken on some kind of flip phone that I had all those years ago. And the second is I'm a terrible photographer. So those two things working together are not going to produce greatness. But anyway, they had this on the wall. And I don't know if anything needs to be said. Have you ever seen anything more insulting than that? Here's a child, could be your child. And here's a chimp. Well, they both have elbows. What does that tell you? What does it tell you? Not what they think it does. And then they have another wall in which they ask the question, how are you related to other living things? And in the center, you have human beings, then you have these other circles around. And so human beings are 98.8% genetically similar to a chimpanzee. How about that? How about that? Well, that just proves what exactly? The other side of the same display, which I thought was interesting, it went on to tell us that we're also 75% genetically similar to a chicken. And we are, in fact, 60% genetically similar to a banana tree. Okay? I'm struggling to follow here. The suggestion that we must come from lower primates because of genetic similarity. Do we also come from banana trees on the same basis? You ever been to a furniture store? And maybe you see, here's a nightstand and a chest of drawers. They do look similar, don't they? Maybe we can make a poster out of this. And maybe we can surmise exactly what is it that we can determine about maybe the origins of the chest of drawers. Maybe the chest of drawers used to be a nightstand, but over millions of years they grew into chest of drawers. They look alike? Is that maybe what he's talking? Similarity in form and composition? Suggests the idea that they must be kin or one came from the other? Did the chest evolve from nightstands? Do they share a common ancestor? I think you see the point. Similarity, yes, but proof of what? I believe that it's evidence not of a common ancestor so much as a common creator. God designed men and animals to live in the same biosphere, same food chain. In Genesis chapter 1, I'm sure you've noticed, or Genesis chapter 2, I'm sorry, you've noticed this before. In Genesis 2 and in verse 7, God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Look down in verse 19 of Genesis 2. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, made of the same dirt, by the same God, to live on the same planet. It hardly suggests that one came from the other. It rather suggests that the same God made them. They come from the same designer, the same creator. It's not surprising. In a world governed by certain physical and chemical laws, as one fellow put it, we should expect some creatures to have a similar design. And all of it, it seems to me, marks us as belonging to our Creator. Just as surely as you can pick up a violin and you can look inside and you can see the maker. In this case, it's a pretty expensive fiddle. It's made by a guy named Stradivarius. It's got his mark on it. So we, unlike the teachings of the atheistic evolutionist who tells us that we came from nothing and we're going nowhere, the Bible presents a much more encouraging picture. What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the Son of Man that thou visitest him? Thou madest him a little lower than the angels. That's the message of God. It's a pretty depressing message when you think about the preaching the world does. Without intelligent intervention. And that's what these folks are saying. This is all random. There's no purpose to it. It's just chance. It's just an amazing coincidence that all of this has developed as it has. If that's so, we are banking faith in several really amazing things. Number one, that something came from nothing. Number two, that order came from chaos and disorder. You ever known that to happen? And number three, that life arose from non-life. Intelligence from non-intelligence. Personality from non-personality. It takes more faith to believe that than it does to believe in a Creator, to believe in God. Which brings me to this point before we close. Why do intelligent people deny intelligent design. And I believe that they do. It's a choice. Why reject God? Well, maybe I don't have all the answers. I'm not accusing any individual, but I would just suggest these are some things that I think fit the profile. Number one, it may be that they've just never considered anything else. You know, one of the questions that I've heard in some of these debates between creationists and atheists is that they will say, well, you know, you got your ideas. Did you grow up in a home that believed in God? Well, that's where you got your ideas from. And sometimes the fellow will ask back, did you grow up in a religious home? Oh, your parents were atheists? Well, that's where you got your ideas from. You know, that works both ways. But I think there are some people who just grow up and they don't hear anything about God at home. They go to school, they never hear about God at school. Their media exposure never presents a positive message about God or about creation. And so perhaps they just literally never thought about anything else other than what they've always been told, and that is that we're just here by chance and that there's nothing beyond the material. Sometimes I think it's much more a determined prejudice. This book you may have heard of. It's written by Dawkins. He called it The Blind Watchmaker, and it sold a lot of copies. But there's a quote, there's several quotes that are really amazing, but one of the quotes that I really am struck by is this one. Dawkins writes, despite all appearances to the contrary, there is no watchmaker in nature beyond the blind forces of physics. Natural selection, the unconscious, automatic, blind, yet essentially non-random processes that Darwin discovered and that we now understand to be the explanation for the existence and form of life, has no purpose in mind. If it can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it is a blind watchmaker. Actually, as we've made the point before, I think he misnamed the book. He shouldn't have called it The Blind Watchmaker. He should have called it The Watch That Made Itself. I think that would have been a better term and more accurate and more ridiculous. There is no watchmaker. This watch made itself. But I love what he says here. I don't love it, but I'm struck by it. Despite all appearances to the contrary. Exactly. I mean, you got to really ignore a lot. You got to put the blinders on in a serious thickness in order to not see the signs of God in His creation. I still don't know what he meant by an unconscious, automatic, blind selection process that's non-random. That's when I'm not smart enough to figure either. No purpose, but it's not random. All right. He, on another occasion, he's one of these guys that just likes to poke the bear. You know, he's got a shirt on that says, "Religion, together we can find a cure." He wrote on one occasion, "It's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." So he's way too smart to help, I'm afraid. But it's not because he has the better argument. It's because despite all appearance to the contrary. You need to know that, young people. You'll hear a lot of bluster out there and a lot of folks who know everything. You need to know that it's in spite of all appearances to the contrary. Those are his words. Lewontin is another guy, Harvard biologist, who was a sort of a maverick. He was an evolutionist, and he was not any friend of religion, but he was the kind of guy that would just say the thing out loud that nobody wanted to say out loud or wanted to say it out loud. And so he was once writing a book review. And without going into all the details, in the book review, he's writing about his position as a materialist and an atheist and just sort of casually admitting that maybe it's not all one-sided in terms of the evidence. The real struggle is between science and the supernatural. He wrote, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises, in spite of the tolerance of scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have an a priori commitment to materialism." We've determined beforehand, this is what we've got to believe, and we'll make the rest of it fit. That's quite an admission. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a materialist explanation of the phenomenal world. But on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanation, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute for, and notice this, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Okay, that's a lot of things, but it ain't honest. So you've got a lot of that as well. And I think there's also a pride involved in this, and the chief seats they sit in, and the ability to look down on all the ignorant believers out there. And the great deal of peer pressure. If you are a paleontologist, if you are a biologist, and you won't go anywhere in your career, you're not going to open many doors. You're going to get a lot of them closed if you even question the party line. One fellow wrote, there's a tremendous pressure in the academic community to publish something that supports evolution. Find something important, and you may have yourself on the cover of National Geographic or the subject of a PBS special. Find nothing, and you may find yourself out of a job, out of grant money, or at least out of favor with your materialist colleagues. Exactly. So, and one more thing I need to mention. I think sometimes people go to this, they go to this position because it frees them from that dreaded moral responsibility. If there's a God, that means there's a judgment day. And that means that I'm going to have to answer for my sins. The best way to get rid of that is just get rid of God. And that takes the whole question off the table. And there are a lot of people who had that very purpose. Julian Huxley, famous family. His brother was a famous author. He was a biologist. And one day in a TV interview, this is back in the 1970s, years ago, just sort of casually was talking about the Darwinism and its prevalence in the academic community. And he said the reason we accepted Darwinism, even without proof, is because we didn't want God to interfere with our sexual mores. Okay. Well, we know, that's pretty blunt, isn't it? Lee Strobel, you may have heard of. He's a Protestant fellow. He wrote a book, what was it called? Cold Case Christianity. He was a detective. That's what he did for a living. And an atheist, sort of hard-boiled, kind of jaded fellow, saw too much of the world. His wife was a believer, and it bugged him. And so, he decided he was going to approach this subject as a detective. Did Jesus exist or not? Is he the Son of God or not? Was he raised from the dead? And his research really led him to become a believer. And he wrote about it in this book. It's a pretty good book. But anyway, he, in talking about his experience, said, I was more than happy to latch onto Darwinism as an excuse to jettison the idea of God so that I could unabashedly pursue my own agenda in life without moral constraints. Same point. These are not the only men. If Darwinism is true, if there's no God, and we all evolved from slimy green algae, then I can sleep with whomever I want. In Darwinism, there's no moral accountability. Exactly. Nothing new, by the way, about that approach. We've all read 1st and 2nd Peter. The book of 2nd Peter closes with a warning about scoffers who would come. And Peter said they walk after their own lust. And they say, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Later on he writes, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing. They're wrong. They're fooling themselves. Be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is one day. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come, as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be? You know, the world's going to burn up, but you're not. You're going to have to face judgment. So what kind of person should you be now, looking to that judgment day to come? In all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hastening unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless we, according to His promise, look for a new heaven and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. Wherefore, beloved, seeing that ye look for such things, be diligent, that you may be found of Him in peace, without spot, and blameless. Exactly. Don't be fooled by voices that pretend sophistication and knowledge and talk nonsense and talk you out of a relationship with God and an eternal home with Him. These people are lost and headed to a place they don't want to go. Don't follow them. Let our faith in what we see around us and what we hear in God's Word keep us rooted and grounded in things eternal. I appreciate your kind attention. I haven't said this, but I'll say it. If you have a question or something, or maybe a disagreement with something I've said, please feel free to talk to me about it. And I appreciate your kind attention and your consideration of these things. I hope they are useful to you. Okay. Gable's going to lead us in a song, Rescue the Perishing, number 790. And if it be your desire to leave the perishing and to join up with the Lord who has done everything to save us, why not tonight? If we're here as a child of God, if we've strayed from Him, return to Him. And if we can help you in any way, let us know how, even right now, while we stand, while we sing.